Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to RealAg Politics. I'm Kelvin Heppner, joined by Shaun Haney of Real Agriculture, and our guest this week on RealAg Politics. We're pleased to welcome in, finally, Dave Carey, Vice President of Government and Industrial Relations with the Canadian Canola Growers Association. Welcome to RealAg Politics, Dave.
Thanks for having me. Good to see you both.
So we want to cover kind of three main things today. We want to talk about the FPT Ag Ministers meeting that's happening in Guelph this week. That meeting started yesterday with presentations from some farm groups. The ministers meeting today, and tomorrow morning, I believe, there's a wrap-up press conference scheduled for sometime early in the afternoon. We also want to talk about the new shadow cabinet announced this morning by Conservative Party leader Erin O'Toole. That one we just added to the list this morning. And the big topic today, we want to talk about how to approach lobbying this current government in Ottawa, how farm groups, how farmers, agricultural organizations, how they should interact and try to have an impact on the Hill. So we are live this afternoon, so feel free to drop your comments, questions, participate in this conversation as we continue with our discussion here. But Dave, maybe let's start with the FPT meeting that's happening in Guelph. You had the chance to speak to the ministers yesterday as part of the Canadian Federation of Agriculture's panel. Bring us up to speed on what you got to talk about and maybe what you think the ministers are discussing in their meeting today.
Yeah, thanks, Calvin. I think this FPT meeting in person, for the most part, in Guelph, has been kind of long awaited, right? It's been delayed a number of times, and we've had assurances that the lines of communication between the federal, provincial ministers and their senior staff have been open throughout the pandemic, but as we've all noted throughout this, that you get a lot more done in person, I think, and you take a lot more away from it. So we had the opportunity to present yesterday. It was, kind of came together quite last minute, given we did not have officially Minister Bibeau return to her role until relatively recently. So CFA invited several farm groups, including CCGA, and we shared our time with the Canola Council. For a government roundtable on the environment, and this was sort of the kickoff. They toured some research facilities. They had a 90-minute panel, and then they had a reception, and then they actually go into the more formal agenda, which is fairly typical, where at the end of it, looking to release a joint statement from the ministers, as you referred to. Our theme was environment, so we tried to play within in that box. So I think we certainly touched on the role that farmers and agriculture has when it comes to climate change in a positive light. From the canola sector, we have pretty ambitious both production and sustainability targets. It was an opportunity to remind ministers that sustainability is sort of that three-legged stool, right? It's economic, it's social, and it's environmental. And you can't really achieve one without acknowledging all three. And that kind of flowed through our presentation. Besides getting into some of the canola specific things, I think one message that we really brought forward, and I think that bears repeating, is the need for representation of agriculture and farm groups at this new burgeoning area of agri-environmental public policy making, and that agriculture needs a seat at that proverbial table, but also that literal table. We're seeing policies roll out that if there had been discussions earlier on, perhaps we could have improved upon them, made them more effective, but also, minimize some of the angst that we hear from the farming community. Chief amongst those, we reiterated our longstanding ask, and of others, that agriculture is currently not represented on the federal government's net zero advisory body, which is making big decisions around how we achieve the targets that this government has set. So that's kind of how we left it, was the importance of agriculture's inclusion in these decision-making bodies, so that we have a chance to inform, reflect our constituents' priorities, concerns, and that farmers are part of the solution, and we should be collaborating as opposed to working against each other.
Okay. Do you expect them to come out of this meeting having made progress on or reached changes in direction or movement in terms of policy ideas coming out of this meeting? I know they've talked about coming out of this meeting with a list of priorities for the next ag policy framework. Do you think that there will be a significant announcement tomorrow that, hey, the ministers have agreed that we're going to do away with a program and move in this direction instead, or something along those lines?
I mean, I think we'll see perhaps a focus on environmental sort of policy making. I think we heard it from all ministers, but it wasn't just hearing from Minister Bebo and industry. All provincial ministers had a chance to reflect their priorities. And I think environmental, climate change, sustainability, whatever you want to call it, it was certainly a topic of discussion. Um, as far, I think they will reach some sort of consensus. Will it be earth shattering? I don't know. The next policy framework or the whole suite of policies, it's a big monolithic thing to move quickly. And I think we lost a lot of public policy making time because of the pandemic. I think we've also lost a lot of policy making time because of the election. So I think big grandiose changes likely aren't in line for the 2023 framework. I think they will come out and agree to the priorities. I think we may see a climate focus to some of the risk management programs, which for farmers could be a good thing for agri stability, things like that. I think they need to reach some sort of consensus after this has been delayed and delayed and delayed. And I think that's fine, and we hope they do. The bigger concern would be the coffer for the policy framework has not changed in 10 years. It's been static. And if we're going to have an increased focus on other areas outside of the kind of core programs, that needs to be additional funds. And if they're environmental focused, those are public goods. We can't reduce agri-marketing or agri-insurance or agri-invest or whatever to focus on environmental programs. So I think I hope there's a consensus that recognizes the economic importance of agriculture and that the framework needs to increase as our economic impact does, and that it's not diluted by a change to more environmental focus, at least from a dollars perspective.
That makes
Dave,
sense.
what do you say to there's some farmers out there I've heard say, they're sending me emails talking about how all it is climate focus. It's all that every climate. There's other things going on. What do you say to those growers that are kind of maybe growing a little bit tired of so much of this all being about the environment?
I think I certainly understand the sentiment. I think I certainly understand as a Canadian, as a taxpayer, the impact. What can the impact Canada have is 1.5% of global emissions versus other markets, without naming countries, that are clearly nowhere near sort of our level of environmental prosperity or sustainability at the farm gate. I would just say that if you look in the House of Commons right now, all parties, with the exception of the Conservatives, are left of center when it comes to environmental policy, right? The Liberals are indistinguishable from the NDP in a lot of ways when it comes to environmental policy. So I think it's easy to sort of say that is the focus of the federal Liberal government, but they're riding public polling, they're riding public sentiment. And I kind of anticipated being asked that. So I looked at some recent polling from Abacus and a few other spots that had 1 in 3 Canadians view climate change as their single most important priority. Actually, 31%. 69% of Canadians believe the Earth is warming. I've got some notes here. 65% of Canadians support the government's new policy to stop exporting coal. 69% support Canada's announcement at COP around reducing the cap and reduce pollution from oil and gas. 3 in 4 Canadians believe that there's still time to put measures in place to stop climate change, but we need to act now. And 66% would like to see governments in Canada put more emphasis on reducing emissions. So, I mean, I think it's easy to target one particular party with that kind of anger, and I certainly understand that. But and it's almost more of an urban versus rural to some degree, where Canadians view this as a priority. Whether that's right or not isn't really up to us to say. And they're tapping into that, so that they really are kind of going with where Canadians are leaning, and that's something that we're going to have to grapple with, right? As more and more Canadians lean into this space, governments are prioritizing it. But I still think there is space to have the economic conversation, the resilience conversation. But we have to speak that language, I guess, that they're speaking, and reflect that Canadians view this way, and the path to majority government in Canada is through Ontario and Quebec, where these national polling numbers are likely even higher. So I understand the frustration, but I think it is also reflective of what we're seeing in urban centers.
Getting back to the FPT meeting, Dave, it sounds like BC, Alberta, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and the territories, those ministers are not actually in Guelph. It is a hybrid meeting like so many other meetings these days. Does that make a difference in terms of how this meeting goes and what we can expect in terms of outcomes?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I know Newfoundland was in the room, as was PEI, and then Quebec and Ontario, and
Manitoba, Saskatchewan
Saskatchewan.
too, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Eichler and Merritt were both in the room, so I think it certainly does. I mean, the sidebar conversations can't happen. There was a reception yesterday evening, but I don't believe the federal government participated in that. So, and I still think that there's a need to demonstrate action. There's a need to demonstrate, a path forward that something was reached, because again, this can has been kicked down the road several times. So I think there's a real appetite for decision to be made. It is different though when you can't sort of grab someone out of a coffee break and have a conversation, or in the hallway. But I think we've all sort of had to pivot in that regard, and so I hope that it doesn't limit any of the productivity. They've got a full plate. When it comes, they're going to be talking labor, business risk management, the priorities for the next policy framework. I know they're talking trade and market access, and African swine fever. They've got an ambitious agenda to get through in 2 days, and certainly wish them luck in getting through it.
We sometimes hear ahead of these meetings that the hard work is done before the meeting, and the heavy lifting is already done. Do you think that's the case here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like going to a pre-budget consultation, a month before the budget's coming out. Certainly that I think they're looking to, kind of reaffirm and confirm that they're on the same direction. I think we know that the ministers are while they're negotiating with each other, the details are done behind the scene by the bureaucrats working together, and that's one thing that perhaps with this virtual nature that they have been in probably discussion more often than they would have previously, where if you want to have these sort of conversations, you have them in person. But yeah, if they want to actually reach consensus sometime tomorrow, they had to be 90% of the way there coming into that meeting. And but hopefully they did take something away from our environmental panel yesterday. We had all the major commodities sort of represented, and the amount of consensus and I think alignment that we have between pork and cattle, CFA, canola, and grain growers, I think it really speaks to we have way more in common than we don't when it comes to the agriculture, producers, farm groups, and we need to focus on what we have in common as opposed to the things we don't agree on.
Well, and the last time this group got together when they were trying to reform BRM, there was a lack of agreement on several components of that. They had a hard time coming together. We got some new fresh faces. We have Horner out of Alberta. We have Thompson out of Ontario. Maybe, I guess you could look at it as, sometimes a fresh look at things with some fresh perspective maybe sort of adds to the mix a little bit.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for, there's no baggage there, right? As you're entering a new role and it's your first FPT in person. I think that there's some other relatively new ministers that at least it was their first FPT. The Nova Scotia minister is new as well. So I think, it's a chance that, as a fly on the wall, the dynamics and body language between ministers seem good. I think, I hope that it's about rising to the occasion and each of them doing what's best for their constituents and their provinces and the producers that they represent as elected officials. So I think that sentiment was carried across. It was Minister Bebo's meeting, but it was co-hosted by Minister Merritt and Minister Thompson from Ontario, given that there's two Thompson ministers at the table now. And it seemed quite cordial.
All right. Why don't we move to the shadow cabinet announcement today? We saw John Barlow, MP for the Foothills in Alberta, a former Conservative agriculture critic, returned to the post after Leanne Rood was the shadow minister for agriculture and agri-food following Aaron O'Toole's leadership of the party. Rood moving over to rural development and broadband strategy, I believe is her title. I noticed food security was also added to John's job description. Your thoughts, Dave, on Barlow returning to the agriculture post in the shadow cabinet for the Conservatives?
Well, I mean, enjoyed working with Leanne as well. I mean, you can't say enough about John. I think he's got the pedigree, he's got the gravitas, he knows stakeholders, he knows the issues, and I think right now too, I think it's really important to have someone from Western Canada in that role because it is within our key ministers are heavily weighted towards Quebec, but Eastern Canada. Leanne's an Ontario MP as well. I think it's really important they have that prairies perspective. I think John will do a fantastic job. He also has a great legislative assistant, Mark Choi, who's been with him for a long time and previously worked for Minister Jerry Ritz. So they really want to be there, and I think that's what's so great about working with someone like John is John wants that portfolio. He wants to be there. He wants to be engaging. He kind of knows everyone, knows the files. Well, you're right, Kelvin. As far as the title, I think if you actually look through all of Mr. O'Toole's announcements, that perhaps he's sort of suggesting what if he formed government, what the names of his departments would be, because there are a number of areas that don't directly line up with the Liberal. I believe digital government is still there, where Prime Minister Trudeau dropped that, and there's a breaking up of some rules. But I mean, John, you can't ask for a better guy and a better person to be there at this really important time, because I think he also just really gets Western Canada and some of those feelings when you see the electoral results versus who's in cabinet. I think having John's voice there, and I know he's in Ottawa next week. I've already talked to him. We're going to get together and chat. I think just important to have that Western focus at that senior table, and it was great to see him return to that role.
Another role that is relevant for ag, and also I think has a new tweak to the name as well. Randy Hoback named to trade, and I believe was supply chain resilience in his job description. I think.
Yeah, so again, you're seeing a return. Randy is passionate about trade. He's passionate about agriculture. He's been on the trade committee for a number of years. Even when he was not serving in an official capacity around trade, Randy was certainly constantly talking about keeping the border open, keeping supply chains open. I sit on the executive board of directors of CAFTA, and Randy's kind of a mainstay for engagement on agriculture and trade. So really pleased to see Randy there. And again, speaks to Mr. O'Toole's priorities as far as supply chain resiliency and food security. Those are not reflected in the ministers they're shadowing, but they're reflective of the priorities that he's sort of outlined. You're reading into it a lot because there's no mandate letters for opposition critics. But seeing Randy return, and then seeing Luc Berthold go to health is also, I think, really good for agriculture. Luc was a former ag critic. Has really spent time getting to know Western Canadian agriculture, prairies agriculture, and is also a Quebecer. So I think hope he can really talk the talk language-wise, but also priorities-wise with the trifecta of our three most important ministers, besides Minister Ng, are Minister Duclos, Minister Bibeau, and Minister Guilbeault. So ECCC, Agriculture, and Health. So I think having someone like Luc over there who can really talk the talk, both in their language of preference, but also in understanding Quebecers and the National Assembly, I think Mr. O'Toole has lined up a very attractive shadow cabinet when it comes to agriculture stakeholders that really pleased to get to work.
Dave, is it common to have like 49 shadow ministers for 39 ministers?
You know what? It's the shadow ministers is still a relatively new thing too, right? Calling them shadow ministers. Always been critics in the past. Shadow ministers much more of a British tradition. But I think we've seen an expanding cabinet. I mean, that often happens in third terms of government. We're up to 38 cabinet members plus the prime minister. I've been asked a bunch of times about why that is, and that's not as big as Mulrooney third term or Harper third term. They're both at 40 plus the PM. But I think there's some new faces around that table too, Shaun, when it comes to around that critic table, around that shadow cabinet. So it's a big group, it's a diverse group, and I think you're always trying to balance rewarding loyalists, promoting rising stars, but also making sure that fresh faces are there to tackle things. Like the new transport critic is Melissa Landsman, kind of a star candidate in Thornhill. So look forward to seeing what they get done. And then, I am very pleased to see Alistair McGregor returned as the NDP agriculture critic. I know he's got like 6 portfolios given their numbers, but Alistair has been a very good critic for agriculture and agri-food. And then seeing Yves Perron for the Bloc returned, I think, is also positive. Yves is a very pragmatic guy when you're in a room kind of one-on-one with him to talk ag or trade. He's continuity is not necessarily a bad thing with all the changes we have in front of us.
Any word on when committee could when the ag committee could resume?
Well, a few pieces have to happen before that. I think we are anticipating chiefs of staff to be confirmed, or they might have already been this afternoon. For, um, you know, the ministers are really important. I know a lot of we're all trying to assign, what is Minister Guilbeault going to do at ECCC, for example, or what is Duclos as a high performing minister going to do differently in health when it comes to, say, PMRA or plant breeding innovation, but. The chiefs of staff that they choose are really important and really set the tone. So Minister Guilbeault, Minister Duclos are both without chiefs of staff. So we're waiting for that. Parliamentary secretaries could be this week. They're also really important. And then mandate letters. As far as when we'll get an ag committee, which obviously become those 10 individuals that are really important. Parliament will resume on November 22nd. Their first order of business is to elect a speaker. I think there's 5 candidates currently. Once the speaker is elected, then they'll constitute committees. And then the committees have to meet to elect their chairs and vice chairs. So we could be a little ways off depending on how things go with this Civil Liberties Caucus, because individual MPs actually have a lot of tools to delay just what happens in the House. They don't normally employ them because, they're points of privilege, but we expect those sort of points of privilege to be made around kind of mandatory vaccinations, which again, don't want to get into the ideological bend, but we need to get back to public policy making here. We need an ag committee back up and running. We need a trade committee back up and running, both in the House and Senate. So, I don't see, unfortunately, that there will be a lot of sort of real getting into the details at a committee level until the new year. But once we identify who those people are, who those 10 on ag and health and trade and environment and climate change, we now know kind of who the key players are, those 30 or 40 MPs that are really have a really strong role to play in agriculture. And it is still a minority government, right? It still is a minority government. The tools we had available before from the outside are still there. So this is not, there's no foregone conclusions, right? So really important, but we hope to get those things in place sooner than later for sure.
I believe O'Toole did say today that all the members of the shadow cabinet will be at the House of Commons in person. So I thought I heard that today.
Yeah, any MP coming to the House will be fully vaccinated and eligible for requirements. So I'm sure that was a discussion when he was putting together his cabinet, as there's some notable exceptions that have been very outspoken around this mandatory vaccination space that you'll notice are not involved with that. Because I believe there is a Conservative caucus meeting here in Ottawa next Wednesday too. So that would indicate that those that aren't present will likely remain sitting in a virtual or hybrid setting until they figure out these points of privilege, which is again a conversation that maybe it's important, but it's also, I want to get into the policy. I want to get it. What does a legislative agenda look like? What does committee business look like? What studies are happening? What does a private member bill order of precedence look like? And get down to the work that I think farmers are expecting, as opposed to parliamentary posturing and using, Westminster parliamentary tradition to stop or delay or assert your will as an MP in the House.
When the Liberals announced their cabinet, when you look at it and some of the words that are used and phrases put together, you sometimes wonder, is this actually a function that they're trying, an issue they're trying to fix that needs to be a priority, or are they speaking to their voters? And I was reminded of the same thing today when I looked at the shadow cabinet, right? Like, I was Leanne Rood, somebody we didn't mention. One of the things in her shadow cabinet position is rural broadband. We already talked about supply chain resiliency. Barlow's got food security. These are things that are more and more appearing as issues in the media. Canadians are aware of them, but I'm still trying to get figured out in my head, what did those, whether you're a cabinet, you're actually the minister or you're the shadow minister, what the heck can you do about it? It's hard to get your head wrapped around that.
Yeah, and they can be innocuous, so it doesn't matter, or they can be a distraction, and it's an issue. It's really good retail politics, though, right? It's the result of polling or focus group work to say, what do Canadians care about? Well, there's no department of small business, right? There's no department of supply chain resiliency. There's no department of digital government, or et cetera. So by putting it at a ministerial level, like with a member of cabinet, it signals that it's a priority for you, that it's a focus. I think it, unfortunately, given a minister they're supposed to be the CEOs of their departments, right? And a member of Privy Council. And being a member of cabinet is not just executing on your portfolio. There's also cabinet committees, which are cabinet committees on the economy, cabinet committees on the environment, where like all the legislative things flow through before they go out to the broader cabinet. So they can be a distraction, unfortunately. Popular with voters though, because they can see I'm a small business owner. I own a laundromat. I own a convenience store, and I see that reflected in Minister Ng's portfolio. She's a inner circle minister. Maybe it makes me feel good, and that's fine so long as it doesn't become a distraction from global affairs and trade. I think a shadow cabinet, it's an opportunity to, again, highlight your priorities, such as supply chain resiliency, food security. It's great to see Leanne back remaining on in shadow cabinet at rural economic development and rural broadband. It's a signal, a number of groups like ours, we met with the Conservatives before the election, just like we met with other Liberals to talk about platform, and rural broadband is certainly an issue that affects a lot of Canadian producers. So, it's a way to reflect their priorities. I think, Shaun, it's also a way to simply differentiate you from that, your combatant, your person across the aisle of this is an area I'm focusing on. And, um, Minister Hutchings being this new standalone rural economic development, it's not such a bad thing either, right? Because she's an outdoors woman. she owned a hunting outfitting company in Newfoundland, so she does care about rural issues. But Leanne lines up again to also say, well, broadband is a key issue that we've heard about, and so a lot of it's political posturing, but it's also a signal of their additional priorities outside their kind of core mandate of criticizing or shadowing their respective minister.
So shifting then from the opposition benches to the government, Dave, you've mentioned the trifecta of important ministers in Quebec: Minister Duclos, Minister Bibeau, and Minister Guilbeault, and of course this overarching focus on climate and net zero policy as it relates to our current federal government. As somebody who's lobbying on the Hill, how do you approach this current government versus maybe how agriculture groups have in the past?
Yeah, and I think we don't have all the kind of trails, breadcrumbs yet. I mean, the mandate letters are so important, right? Especially in a minority government where, whether good or bad, if it's on that priority list, it's on the to-do list, right? It's on the list of the minister to execute on, to address, to collaborate with. So hopefully we will see that soon, which will really give us an indication. I think we just have to understand the perspective of those we're having conversations with, right? And these are not Twitter conversations, because I see the outrage or I see this is so obvious. These aren't 280 character conversations, right? These are individuals. You need to first have them pay attention to you, get into the room with them. You have to be taken seriously. So I think, I've kind of got a few approaches that I'm happy to suggest, but collaborative and solutions oriented are critical. You can bring concerns forward, but you need to bring a path forward that will resonate with the minister. This is the government that we have, and I mentioned earlier, this government is reflecting the priorities they feel Canadians have based on polling. I think there's a counterweight to that, which is affordability, where ideology only goes so far when grocery store bills or gas prices or cost of living or mortgage rates go up. Ideology tends to go out the door, and you get that balance, unfortunately. I'd say there's sort of 5 that I'd say are going to be really key for ag and producer groups going forward. One is persistence. There's sort of 5 P's I just kind of made up this afternoon, but persistence. You need to be there. You need to be telling your story. You need to not, it's not a once a year fly the board in, have a lobby day, call it quits until next February. It's about being persistent. I expect to be close to 30,000 registered meetings with the Commissioner for Lobbying. How many of those are going to be agriculture is important, because you're showing that you are there. You're there to speak on your behalf. You're following things. It's hard to ignore the squeaky wheel sort of thing. So persistence, policy prioritization. I think we often get asked, why is this group or this segment so successful? Is it aerospace? Is it supply management? Why are they so successful? I think they do a really good job, agnostic of industry. They prioritize, right? They keep their powder dry except for the most important issues. And they're able to say, 1, 2, 3, ABC, these are the issues that we're advancing. now. And this is where we're putting our priorities. You can't have 40 priorities to talk to the same minister about. Think of it just from a staff perspective. I can't talk to the minister's chief of staff about 13 different issues. I get 30 minutes with her once a month. Third would be partnerships, and I kind of spoke to that. I think the level of collaboration, considering we did not all get together in advance for the environment roundtable yesterday afternoon in Guelph, the fact that Canadian Federation of Agriculture talking about carbon tax and fertilizer, the fact that cattle and pork and grain growers and canola are all really on the same page, with our own commodity perspective, but partnerships. That's part of the litmus behind the Agriculture Carbon Alliance is we need to work with SM. We need to work with export oriented. And I think also we need to, expand out and look for additional partnership opportunities. Agriculture is an industry first. It's an agriculture industry second. And I think we need to start focusing on the fact that we're an industry like a lot of other industries. And it's not just about going to ag. It's not just about CFIA. This is about trade. And this is about ISED. This is about finance. This is about Treasury Board. And the last two, I guess, are kind of interchangeable. Understanding the political realities. There are certain political realities. This government ran on climate change. This cabinet is doubling down on their climate change priorities. You can rail against and be excluded, or you can have a conversation that says, we understand this is a priority, but so are these. And how can we, meet these mutual goals that you're trying to advance? And the last is, I just think we need to do a better job of understanding, public opinion, which I kind of walked you guys through a little bit earlier. It's just Canadians feel this way. So for O'Toole or the Conservatives, because I hear this all the time, we can't change direction radically because once the next election, the Conservatives come in, they're going to fix all of our problems. Well, if the Conservatives are going to fix all of our problems, they're only going to be a one-term government. Mr. O'Toole will likely have to have a more robust environmental platform to win a majority. The path to majority requires going through these urban centers. So how can we be at the table? How can we make sure that this climate change objective doesn't impact farmers negatively, or at least mitigate that impact, are going to be really important. And, at the end of the day, there's no silver bullet. So let's look at what other industries, both in agriculture and outside, what do they do really well? What are the best management practices that we can employ to try to encourage this government to take us seriously? We've got a huge economic story to tell. We've got a great environmental story to tell. We've got a great trade and feeding the world story to tell. But there's not that many seats where a lot of food is produced. There's not that many seats in the House of Commons in the prairies. There's 62 of 338. There's almost 200 in Quebec and Ontario alone. How do we bridge those things in a way that is constructive, that people want to engage with us? And I think it's just we got to keep going. And if we don't, others are going to tell our story for us. There's some groups that I think have gained quite a bit of momentum with this government around kind of the farmers and climate focused. They're going to listen to them, or they're going to listen to groups like the Carbon Alliance or canola or grain growers or cattlemen. I think we just have to realize that those are the realities we have. We don't get to pick. We don't.
Dave, do we have enough resources for this multi-front, to use the phrase multi-front war? This battle where we're not just talking to agriculture, which maybe in the 1970s that's all we had to do, right? Now we're having to meet with health. We're having to meet with immigration. We're having to meet with trade. ECCC, more and more. Probably 30 years ago we didn't meet. Well, I don't know if there was a Minister of Environment at the time, but you know what I mean. And so because the load here is increasing, because agriculture is kind of one of those industries that does spread across so many different parts of the government's portfolio. Do we have enough people capacity to do this? Do we have enough star power to tackle this? As we do a little bit of looking in the mirror, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. It's a tough one to answer, but I'll certainly do my best. I think we have the resources. Do we have the mandate? Do we have the cover and the marching orders to, I'm not speaking for just CCJ here, but do we have the marching orders to do what needs to get done? Do we have the cover for that farmers know that their national farm groups are saying what they need to say to get the absolute best case scenario policy outcome? Do the grassroots understand that 75% of what we do here in Ottawa is risk mitigation. it's stopping things or softening or delaying or whatever word you want to use. Is that well known and well understood? Like, do we have the mandate to say these are our few? I mean, I'm saying again across all of agriculture, not just my organization. Do we have the mandate to say, can we pick the 3 or 4 big issues and that's it? That is what we lean into. That way we're not pulled in so many different directions. So I think we have the resources. I don't know if we have the mandate. I don't know if we have the will. I don't know if we have the trust, again, across all agriculture associations, to let individual groups lead on certain areas, right? Umbrella groups are important for that, but everyone wants a seat at the table and everyone wants a voice. And agriculture is not homogenous, and that's by the amount of groups that we see in the space, and provincial groups wanting to come to Ottawa too, right? And I think it's more a matter of being more organized, being more concerted, and again. But I think if you look at what groups like oil and gas do really well, or aerospace, not that they reduce their principles, but it's almost like the way the Liberals win over the Conservatives. They do what it takes to win. They say what it takes to win. Oil and gas going to net zero by 2050 has been very well received. I don't know how they're going to do it, but it's been very well received, and it gives them cover to work on it, right? It gives them that public trust that, well, maybe we'll delay that consultation. They've got an ambitious target. Do we have the ability to do that in agriculture? Do we have the ability to have those hard internal conversations to say what you're going to see reflected publicly is what we have to do, even though it might not be well liked at the coffee shops in rural Canada? And I just don't know if we have that quite yet.
That comment about the risk management or damage control that happens in Ottawa, I think that's interesting, and something that I'm not sure we realize, or we take it for granted, and then we sometimes wonder, how did this policy get this far? And that obviously that's what happens when there aren't people in Ottawa to speak for agriculture's interests in that sense.
Yeah, it's sort of like you didn't like this. You should have seen where it started. Like, it was way out there. So like what we ended up with, we're actually kind of happy about.
Well, and to just think again of the perspective of the bureaucrats or regulators who are working on this day in and day out. Largely urban Canadians, largely urban suburban Canadians, largely Canadians that are reflected in those those polling priorities I said earlier. So it's just a matter of making sure, and that's why I think it's so important that we advocate for agriculture having a seat at that table when some of these decisions, even at a small p policy level, are ongoing. Is that right now environmental policy making, I guess pandemic aside, are being made at ECCC and Gatineau. Like, I can almost see their offices from mine across the bridge. That's where those decisions are being made, right? And that's where, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada is about 8 kilometers south of my office here. Like that. These are urban folks that are reflecting, I think, what they see in their communities and what they hear. And of course, Ottawa is here too. And, I guess a lot of things don't see the light of day. A lot of consultations, nuance gets added to them. But a lot of it is risk management, right? And trying to inform parliamentarians of, like, if you go this direction, there's going to be issues, and trying to soften it. But again, we all in our space, and it doesn't matter who you are or how good you are, or what gravitas you have. There's still just the political realities of the PMO decides something. It's very difficult to change that. The ministers then take those marching orders. The chiefs of staff take those marching orders. And if you're in a room, 3 of us in a room together, and you needed something from me, and I fundamentally told you, this is a non-starter. There's a power imbalance between stakeholders and government. There just is. Government is formed. Stakeholder groups try to get access, try to get, try to get the ear of them, try to move the needle on things, try to, pump the brakes and other things. But there is a power imbalance. So if you were to come to me with something that you needed, and I don't really need to do anything, and you don't speak my language, it's very easy for me to ignore you.
Along those lines, one thing I think we encounter in the media, especially when we are looking for information or interviews or seeking statements from other departments other than agriculture, we often get sent back or redirected back to the agriculture department. There's a sense that, or at least my perception is, there's a feeling of, this is too technical. We don't really understand agriculture and farming, so we're going to pass it back to AFC to answer these questions and deal with it. How do you address or approach that aspect of lobbying when you're, of course, working with these non-agriculture ministers and departments and bureaucrats coming from the background that you described, Dave?
Dave, before you start, I just want to tell you, this is one of my greatest pet peeves. Okay, so we are now embarking on something that I feel extremely frustrated about, how the Minister of Rural Economic Development couldn't figure out how it's a good idea to talk to farmers. So I will now let you answer the question. Proceed with caution.
It has been an absolute uphill battle, I'd say. I think that the organizations I've worked in, we've been able to move that needle a bit, but a lot of it comes down, Shaun, I think, just having those relationships with those folks at those other departments. But that is not a short-term turnaround. There's no introductory email that all of a sudden, gets you on that quick call return, or that, the kind of personal level where you can shoot them a text message. But so I think what we do, at least at Canola, is we lead into the economics of our sector. 29.9 billion, 207,000 jobs, 11.9 billion in exports, largest ag commodity, 43,000 farmers. Kind of what I said earlier, we're an industry first, agriculture industry second, is really the way that I try to convey it to an urban suburban government. You do really have to sort of thread the needle for some folks as to, for example, going to Health Canada to say, hey, I need to talk to you about something agriculture related. You really have to draw the lines between Health Canada, well, CFIA and PMRA, both critical departments, critical agencies, are creatures of Health Canada. You really have to thread that needle. I think that it depends on, I guess, who you're talking with, Shaun, but if it's anyone at the kind of minister's office level, it's just reminding them of their mandate. Mandate letters, again, are helpful for that. And I think reminding them or getting in there, and one of the things that we really try to accomplish is becoming a resource for that group too, right? This is it's a two-way door, and oftentimes they will need access to information. Going to the department there is slow. When I was a staffer, it was go to the caucus liaison, go to the Library of Parliament. That's slow. You can get something from us, in 10 minutes if I'm sitting at my desk and your email comes in. So I think some of it's earning some goodwill, but it's still an uphill battle. And then you get everyone changes seats, and you get brand new staff everywhere, and the conversation starts again, right? All of our conversations with Minister Wilkinson's chief of staff, the corporate history will be there, as he'll likely follow the minister to NRCan. No, he's exited politics entirely. So there goes 3 years of corporate history, relationships out the door. You start over. But agriculture is an industry first, Shaun, and I think we can't get so technical so quickly. We can't get into the acronyms so quickly. We can't get into the issues so quickly. We're an important industry. We're here to talk to you about our mutually beneficial, our mutual objectives. And there's, just like in every line of work, there's good bureaucrats and really good political staffers, and there's some that will probably never put it together. But we've engaged, as us and the Ag Carb Alliance right before the election, we were with economic development, PMO, finance, Treasury Board, health, ECCC, natural resources, trade, and we were able to make the case that there's a reason we're talking to you. We know what we're doing here. We're talking to you because your mandate, your boss's mandate, intersect with ours. And I think once they kind of make that conclusion that the probably pain point, it's better to engage with me than not. There's ways of escalating it if someone doesn't get back to you either. And sometimes taking a 30-minute meeting from just a risk management perspective or opportunity cost perspective is better than being in an hour meeting to explain why so and so group has escalated it above them. But it's an ongoing, Sisyphus with his boulder, and then it falls back down, and you pick it up again. Yeah, you have to be willing to do that in this line of work, though.
It's just not all scotch and networking parties, right, Dave? We talked about that before.
That's part of it.
So, yeah. Less so of late.
All right. Well, you obviously have lots to do there, Dave. So we thank you very much for taking the time to join us today and to discuss the FPT meeting, the shadow cabinet, also this whole approach to lobbying with this federal government. Certainly, you have lots of insight, and thanks for sharing it with us this afternoon.
Well, and thanks to both of you for you're chasing down important stories right now. Asking Minister Bebo tough questions recently, important questions, and I think you guys have a huge role to play in this too, right? Shining the light on things and digging into it. Certainly appreciate you guys chasing down things that sometimes individual organizations can't because of our own whatever. So appreciate the work that RealAg does too, and always a pleasure to chat.
Very kind words. Thank you, Dave.
Stay well.
Thanks a lot, Dave.
Cheers.
Thanks everyone for joining us here on RealAg Politics this afternoon. We'll definitely be covering what happens tomorrow when it comes to the conclusion of the FPT Ag Ministers meeting in Guelph. So stay tuned for developments there. You can, of course, find all our coverage on realagriculture.com and on SiriusXM on RealAg Radio. With that, though, thanks again for joining us, and we'll talk to you again soon. Take care, everyone.